Hey, hello everybody. This is All Source News of Stefano Rindale, giving you guys the latest video on the dynamics within the Sinaloa Cartel Civil War. And I'm going to be leveraging, as always, the active cartel map to kind of give you guys an explanation. But I think there's a important couple of things to highlight that has kind of developed recently, and we're starting to get more solid reporting on kind of the new alliances forming in Sinaloa. As you recall, currently the Sinaloa Cartel Civil War is being fought by two main factions of the Sinaloa Cartel, one of them being Los Chapitos, who are the sons of El Chapo, and Mayito Flaco, who's the son of Mayo Zambada. Within the Chapitos, really the only two leaders left is Ivan Archibaldo and Jesus Alfredo, and they have a key alliance with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and Gente del Guano. On the Mayito Flaco side, we know of the alliance that they have with Chapo Isidro, or the Mesa Flores organization. And reporting that we got over the summer indicated they might now have an alliance with the Northeast Cartel, or CDN, that is based out of Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas. And that's a very interesting development. We first saw rumors of this in the summer, and subsequently it does indicate that that alliance is further confirmed and actually much more active than we previously assessed. These are very interesting alliances because they really change the dynamic on the ground and only shows an intensification of the violence in Sinaloa, and also opens up the possibility of CDN maybe assisting Mayito Flaco in other areas of Mexico, such as Zacatecas. And with that, I'll show you guys the map and really highlight and visualize what I'm talking about. So a lot of my regular listeners would be very familiar with this map. It's a great tool. I'll make sure to share the link at the video so you guys can track the latest developments going on and kind of the territorial controls. Just as a reminder, this is probably the most up-to-date and active map really talking about Mexican cartels. A lot of times when you see other maps talking from a think tank perspective, they kind of gloss over and just put Sinaloa cartel or Gulf cartel on all as if it's one organization. And it really doesn't break down the complexity in the different territories and terrains that are really actually going on in Mexico. And so from here, you can see there's a lot of kind of territorial control. Obviously, Sinaloa being the main focus, which is kind of this general area right now in Mexico. And highlighted in purple is kind of the Mayito Flacos with the strong presence in Durango, that being Los Cabreras. In yellow here, we have what I was talking about, the Chapo Isidro Mesa Flores. Historically, they've been part of the BLO, or the Veteran Levian organization. Chapo Isidro really has that strong presence in the yellow areas of Guasave, which is right here, Sinaloa. And then if you go down further into Sinaloa, this is kind of the cyan color here is the area of Los Chapitos. The Chapitos have a key alliance with what's highlighted here, kind of in this reddish color, which is the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. And the other lines that I mentioned to you, really have to zoom in, is kind of this different color right here. This is Gente del Guano, right? So the alliance right now is between the small territory here, Gente del Guano, which is led by El Guano, which is the brother of El Chapo, out of Badiraguato. I have a previous video kind of explaining the significance of that. Having an alliance, Gente del Guano, with Los Chapitos and Jalisco New Generation Cartel within the Sinaloa Cartel Civil War. How Mayito Flaco responded, even before the Chapitos CJNG alliance, how Mayito Flaco responded is having an alliance right here with Chapo Isidro specifically, and that's kind of part of the Mayito Flaco. And what we're getting reporting now indicates, is that to zoom out, is this specific faction right here, this specific cartel called CDN, Cartel del Noreste, or the Northeast Cartel, based out of Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas. A specific faction, it looks like, that are now active in the alliance with Mayito Flaco is that of Los Chukis, which is a key faction of the of CDN. Los Chukis is led by a guy named Ricky, who's been detained by Mexican authorities. He was considered, a lot of people called him number 2 in the leadership ranks of the CDN. I kind of viewed him more in the 3rd tier, but I mean, it's up for debate. The consensus, he's number 2. I just have a personal maybe bias or a different opinion where I considered him number 3. But regardless, he was a very senior figure of the CDN, and he was captured, and he did control Los Chukis factions. And the reporting that we're getting is that CDN has now much more of a solidified alliance with Mayito Flaco to fight against Los Chapitos, as kind of highlighted in this skull fighting right here in this area. And the question then becomes, is CDN going to then start sending forces into Sinaloa to fight? But I think one area that you also would have to kind of look into is the violence in Zacatecas. Kind of really have to kind of zoom in a little bit. And this is kind of where the Zacatecas, is kind of right here. Zacatecas is kind of broken up, with the northern part of Zacatecas being under the control of Mayito Flaco, and the kind of more of the southern half is kind of controlled by CJNG, Jalisco New Generation Cartel. This town right here, Villanueva, is considered like a front line. It's one of the main territories within Zacatecas where these two cartels actively fight. We see the groups trying to upload videos. And this is really one of the center areas. And recently we did see a video, which I made a short about, of intense violence along areas in northern Zacatecas. It appears that a specific leader of Jalisco New Generation Cartel out of Zacatecas called El Chapo, he's one of the key leaders of CJNG and very close to El Mencho, the overall leader of CJNG. He led an offensive that kind of conducted a lot of attacks against Mayito Flaco and Mexican government authorities in Zacatecas, recently targeting various areas up here. And so that activity, and I bring that up because CDN historically has had a presence in northern Zacatecas. Within the last couple of years, that presence has really been reduced. We have seen even historically some violence between Mayito Flaco and CDN years ago around Zacatecas. But the CDN presence in Zacatecas, although they still have a presence, they kind of lost influence throughout the years in Zacatecas. They have lost some of that influence, mostly to the hands of Mayito Flaco. But there's always been this understanding that both sides have a solid agreement and understanding. And we do know from an important U.S. intelligence update, the DEA threat intelligence update that kind of covered Mexican cartels, that Mayito Flaco and CDN have a very solid business alliance, right? In other words, CDN really doesn't control a lot of the drug production in Mexico. They're a pusher because they control a lot of the territories with the borders of the United States, as you can see here in Texas. And since they don't control the actual drug production, they rely on other cartels and groups to push either products or migrants through the territory, and that's how they made money. And we do know within the years that although in the past, CDN and kind of the Sinaloa cartel as a whole, specifically Mayo Zambada back in the day, they might have had some tensions and some fighting since CDN lost some of their influence in northern Zacatecas. That quickly then transitioned to a very solid business alliance. And now we're seeing that CDN might actually join forces with Mayito Flaco and even Chapo Isidro to fight Los Chapitos, Cartel and CJNG. And so a lot of people are looking at CDN specifically to fight here in Sinaloa. But what I'm looking for more interesting is, and the interesting reporting is, do we start seeing CDN fighters fighting Jalisco New Generation Cartel specifically along Zacatecas as shown here? Because that would make a lot of sense. CDN does have a historical understanding of Zacatecas. They've leveraged Zacatecas as a transit point for a lot of drugs. Mayito Flaco clearly gives the drugs and migrants and other products to CDN to push into the United States through Zacatecas up to Tamaulipas and Nuevo León and even up to here in Coahuila so they can push products. And this is kind of one of the areas that I'm looking for down here. The other area I'm looking for to see, do we start seeing CDN fighters moving over here, which is the Juarez cartel or La Línea, right? Because Mayito Flaco, as shown here, has had intense fighting against members of La Línea, as shown in this kind of these skulls right here around Chihuahua. And a lot of the fighting is centered around Ojinaga. And Ojinaga is still under the control of La Línea, the Nuevo Cartel de Juárez. But, Mayito Flaco is really pushing a lot of his offenses as shown here. So the question then becomes, do we see CDN, specifically Los Chukis, maybe in Zacatecas, maybe in Sinaloa, but do they support Mayito Flaco's offensive against La Línea or the Juarez cartel? And as shown here by this line, we do know that La Línea has an alliance with Jalisco New Generation Cartel. And that's how they push a lot of their products, right? The Jalisco New Generation Cartel has a lot of alliances and ability to push products into the United States, one of them being the Metros, which for all intents and purposes is really CJNG and Tamaulipas. But La Línea and the Nuevo Cartel de Juárez has always relied on CJNG to push products and drugs into the United States. And La Línea is very well known to also be very much involved in human smuggling. And so Mayito Flaco has been trying to take away that territory to expand his reach along the border with the United States because he really doesn't have that much territorial control along the border. And so this is a perfect opportunity also for CDN to expand their influence along the border through a possible alliance with Mayito Flaco against La Línea and Chihuahua. Because again, La Línea has an alliance with CJNG, and although historically La Línea has fought Los Chapitos from Sinaloa, specifically in Sonora, we've seen La Línea and Los Chapitos actually now have a ceasefire because basically Chapitos can't fight multiple wars because they can't even fight alone Mayito Flaco, so they have to rely on other groups. And so we do know that Los Chapitos have a ceasefire with La Línea. And there could be even conversation is that La Niña is the next in line to join this kind of strategic alliance between Chapitos, Cartel, and Jalisco New Generation Cartel, right? So this is somewhere else that I'm looking into for this construct of CDN, right? Because CDN is engaged in a very heavy fighting against the Metros, which is, again, they're a Gulf Cartel faction, but that's the group I mentioned earlier that, for all intents and purposes, the Metros are the Jalisco New Generation Cartel in Tamaulipas, right? So we do know CDN and Metros are fighting actively, very much so and very intensely, and the Metros have that alliance with Jalisco New Generation Cartel. So does CDN now take an advantage with Mayito Flaco and expand their influence either in Sinaloa and fighting Chapitos and CJNG in Sinaloa? Do they expand that fighting into CJNG territory, specifically around Zacatecas? Or there's also the possibility of Chihuahua. Again, this is kind of a very interesting development because generally when we talk about Mexican cartels, historically what we've seen is groups fracture, cartels fracture, and then you have these subgroups forming, and that's where violence goes up. Generally, it's the fracturing of the cartels, either because of a leader is captured or violence just kind of raises significantly, that causes violence to go up. But now what we're seeing, and I think what we're seeing in 2025, is the opposite. It's these forming of alliances and almost in a way consolidation of the cartel dynamics inside of Mexico that is actually causing violence to go up. It's not the fracturing, it's the consolidation of the alliances forming. And are we in a situation in Mexico now that, although historically I've always said when you're analyzing Mexico and you're analyzing cartel violence inside of Mexico, you have to view it from, there's multiple cartel wars that go on that are not necessarily tied to each other. For example, the violence in Michoacan has nothing to do with the violence in Tamaulipas. Those are two separate conflicts. But is there a scenario between what we're seeing already this year and in the future, next year, possibly further down the road, which now all these different violence and wars and conflicts inside of Mexico somewhat start to be much more connected to each other and tied together? Because I think the Chapitos CJNG alliance really transformed the dynamics of Mexican cartels, right? It really was a fundamental change in the construct of Mexican cartel landscape that really kind of sends shockwaves across the of everything we're seeing in Mexico. And we've seen Mayito Flaco really respond to it. And so now, is there a possibility that cartels are concerned of Jalisco New Generation's cartels' dominance and expansion, specifically with the Chapitos, that they respond? And we've seen Mayito Flaco right now really focus those alliances only in Sinaloa and fighting CJNG not only in Sinaloa, but separately by himself, let's say in Zacatecas or in Chiapas, further down south of Mexico, which borders Guatemala. But now with this construct of CDN, do we see now the violence in Tamaulipas can now be connected in a way or have much more of a direct link with the violence in Sinaloa when in the past those were two separate conflicts? But the CJNG Chapito alliance and now the Mayito Flaco impossible CDN alliance, specifically with Los Chukis, can actually tie the violence in Tamaulipas, which is again right here, this area in Northeast Cartel, can that tie with the violence here in Sinaloa? And I think that's a very interesting dynamic that historically we haven't necessarily seen, because in other areas, historically in Mexico, we have seen groups consolidate or form alliances temporarily to fight an up-and-coming group. Specifically, a perfect example is that of Michoacan, right? Michoacan is a perfect example of, which is this area right here, where we've seen historically groups form alliances to fight off an up-and-coming threat. So before it was the Zetas, then Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and I have a video talking about Michoacan already previously, right? And now Jalisco New Generation Cartel is fighting Carteles Unidos, the Knights Templars, the Viagra Cartel that used to be part of the Carteles Unidos, looks like has now switched sides and joined Jalisco New Generation Cartel. But the violence in Michoacan has always been kind of that own area of violence, not necessarily connected in one way, shape, or form with another cartel. And that's one of the aspects where we've seen groups joining forces to push somebody out, like I said, the Zetas. And then when the Zetas were kicked out of Michoacan, the violence within the groups kind of all went back to basically each group fighting each other. Jalisco New Generation Cartel comes in, these groups form, trying to fight Jalisco New Generation Cartel, but right now it does look like in Michoacan, Jalisco New Generation Cartel has the upper hand, fighting against, let's say, Carteles Unidos. So is this an opportunity for then Mayito Flaco to look at this situation and say, I have a possible alliance, and this is somewhere else where I can hit Jalisco New Generation Cartel because now they're involved in Sinaloa. So do we see Mayito Flaco try to expand his influence inside of Michoacan to really hurt Jalisco New Generation somewhere else, because we do know of key figures of Jalisco New Generation cartel based out of Michoacan are also active in Sinaloa. So there is a reason why Mayito Flaco might want to expand those alliances in response to Jalisco New Generation Chapitos. And I think that's what's fascinating about this situation in Mexico, is that the violence is going up because of these groups forming alliances and consolidating, not because they're splintering. We always see reports here and there of one group splintering off, and generally it's very local, and they splint off, etc. A bigger cartel kind of fractures in all these smaller ones, and violence goes up. But this is fundamentally different because it's happening at the national level. It's not just only in Michoacan where groups form an alliance to fight off an up-and-coming threat. Now we're seeing this dynamic play out in multiple areas in Mexico. And I think that's what we're looking into for the remainder of 2025 and 2026. When the Chapitos CJNG alliance was first announced, I was talking to an account that tracks Mexican cartels. And the question then becomes, how does Mayito Flaco respond? And the groups we immediately identified was Chapo Isidro, which he has an alliance, CDN, which looks like he also has an alliance. And the other one we were looking at too was La Nueva Familia Michoacana and Carteles Unidos, because of the intense violence that those two cartels have against CJNG. Do they then start forming part of this alliance? And now you have two major groups, right? There's always going to be areas in Mexico that have independent cartels and all these other separate groups. But are those two the next ones? The other ones to look at, right? Because that's Michoacan. But the other ones to look at also is right here in Sonora, this area highlighted in yellow, right? That in yellow right here, this right here was Chapitos territory. This used to historically be a very stronghold of los Chapitos. But prior to the Sinaloa Cartel Civil War, the Chapitos suffered an internal split where various factions under los Chapitos formed a loose group called the Independent Cartel of Sonora. And they've been fighting both La Línea and los Chapitos, La Línea in Chihuahua and los Chapitos in Sonora. Do we see the Independent Cartel of Sonora possibly getting in line with the Mayito Flaco? The problem there is you'll notice there's some purple in Sonora, right? You'll notice some here with the Mayito Flacos, etc. One of the key factions there is called Los Rusos. Los Rusos are a key faction of Mayito Flaco active in Sonora. And one of the key groups of the Independent Cartel of Sonora is called Los Salazars. The Rusos and the Salazar has had a very long violent conflict, both sides fighting each other. Even when the Sinaloa cartel was won, even when Los Chapitos still had an absolute control of Sonora, the main internal violence in Sonora, even when the Sinaloa cartel was the dominant one, was between Los Salazar and Los Rusos. Now Los Salazars broke off from Los Chapitos. Los Rusos are still Mayito Flaco. They still have a lot of tensions, but it's not out of the realm of possibility to maybe see Los Salazars saying, hey, let's let bygones be bygones. Let's focus on a greater threat, or let's focus on a common enemy. So is that somewhere else? Is the Independent Cartel of Sonora another possibility where we see this? Because you can kind of make the argument that the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, Chapitos, Gente del Guano Alliance already has the metros in the Tamaulipas, right? Even though they call themselves a Gulf Cartel faction, we know for a fact that they're just basically CJNG Tamaulipas. We've talked about the role of La Línea or El Nuevo Cartel de Juárez in Chihuahua and how they might be incorporated into this overall alliance. So you can see, again, these power dynamics playing in groups and cartels that used to be separate or fighting each other, realizing they need to be this consolidation in how to respond. But that all happened because of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel Chapito Alliance fundamentally changed the situation in Mexico. I mean, fundamentally, without equivocation. And so a lot of this in this video, I know is a little bit more speculation. It's more trying to give a rapid analysis and seeing what's going on and things, what we can look for the future. And it's, maybe it does or maybe it doesn't. And that's where you kind of have to really keep an eye on the Mexican dynamic every single day because it can change in a second. But I think it's very important that from at least an analytical construct, highlighting that how we used to reframe Mexican cartel violence because of fractures and that's what caused violence to go up. Now it might be something completely different. Where again, these alliances are the main problem now for Mexico, and we really don't have a solid answer on how the Mexican government would be able to respond. I mean, that's where I think the big problem is. How does Mexico and the United States, for that matter, respond to now possibly two major cartel alliances battling out for control of the Mexican cartel and drug trade and human trafficking trade into the United States? How can Mexico and the United States respond to that? Because it's one thing to analyze it from various different cartels, all kind of fractured and fighting each other and having business alliance one with another, but they're all kind of separate and it's transactional and business side, the only real relationships they have. But once you start talking about that's a problem. That's a problem for Mexico and the United States, especially if you have two main groups. And how do you do it? Because the problem you're also going to run into, if you weaken one, inherently the other one's going to gain strength. And when they're fractured in different groups, it might be a little bit easier to handle and manage that and ensure that one doesn't become a behemoth. But we're quickly running into a situation where you have two behemoths in Mexico battling for control inside of Mexico, and then those two cartels, both the Jalisco New Generation cartel and the Mayito Flacos, have a lot of international reach, regardless of the situation within the Sinaloa cartel civil war. So that presents a lot of problems for both Mexican government and the United States government that I don't necessarily think it's being really considered or analyzed. And so with that, I always recommend everybody here, please let me know what you think, comment below. Let me know if you agree with this assessment. Do you think consolidation is happening? Or do you think it's on the contrary, that a lot of the reporting that we're seeing of these alliances might just be propaganda and not really transformative as much as I might have said, suspect? And more importantly, how do you think the United States government or the Mexican government can really respond to this with all the constraints and problem sets that are really existing inside of Mexico? So again, I want to thank everybody here for listening to this. I will definitely make a video sooner than 2 or 3 weeks. I've been really hesitant to make a long form video, but this was one of those topics that I think really require deeper analysis. And with that, thank you very much.